Today, we're talking about the very business model that print shops use and the pressures that they face, which are going to grow in 2022. This is the weekly Printavo's screen printing industry newsletter. I'm Luke Gardner, and let's dive right in. So, the screen printing industry is a really big umbrella. I think everybody who works in it knows that. I mean, what is a print shop anyway? Is the 17-year-old kid that's starting up a business in their garage a print shop? Is our video editor Chris, who had a screen printing setup in his room, was he a print shop? How about a print shop at $1 million? I think we're pretty comfortable saying that, right? But what about the print shops like, Liquid Graphics in California that are way, way scaled up? I mean, they're more like manufacturers than a print shop, aren't they? And then there's print brokers and all these other niches, like printing for medical supply companies or even screen printing like electrical components. I mean, this is a big, big industry. There's no question about it. But it's coming under a lot of pressure. So one of the fundamental questions that we ask at Printavo a lot is how many print shops are there? And if you ask different people, you're going to get really different answers. So we sort of guesstimate that it's something like there's probably one print shop in the United States per 5 to 10,000 people. And if you do the math on the population, that means that there's something like 66,000 on the high end to 33,000 shops on the low end. Does that sound crazy? Part of me thinks that sounds really high. And then part of me is also well, wait, that might actually be right. So why is there so much pressure if there's so many print shops? It's kind of obvious, right? There's a really low bar to entry. I mean, anybody can go buy this stuff and start jamming out shirts. It's a really entrepreneurial market. So if you're an entrepreneur and want to make money, this is a great way to do it. There's super low margins in the business. So even if you are making money, you're probably having to sell a lot to make a lot of money. The customers don't really appreciate what you do. I think a lot of people just imagine you have some machine that prints a t-shirt in the back and that's it. Hiring is really hard. People just don't see this as a career option. And there's a lot of ways to get people shirts. You could do this so many ways that often the one way you've done it is a bad idea to someone else, and someone else's brilliant strategy seems like a terrible idea to you. The point I'm getting at is that there's a lot of ways to operate in this business, but each layer in the business adds risk. So what am I talking about here? Print shops have to absorb a lot of risk. Just think about what happens if something goes wrong from your supplier. You, as the print shop, have to swallow whatever the customer says. You have to do whatever they want. No one's leaving nasty Google reviews complaining about Sanmar because the print shop couldn't get the garments fast enough. They're complaining about the print shop not being able to get garments, period. Do you see the problem here? That print shop is under the pressure from a layer here on the top and another layer on the bottom of the customer. So when I think of these layers, what are the layers in the screen printing industry? Layer 1 is probably the least diverse and most commodified in the space. These are the big suppliers and manufacturers. They're the big companies that both distribute t-shirts and manufacture equipment and serve print shops. They're really focused on complexity. What they actually do, isn't just sell you a blank t-shirt to print on. They actually have built an infrastructure to serve every print shop in the United States, all those 33 to 66,000 print shops. And they can send them as many t-shirts as those shops want. The systems engineers in these companies are managing operations that span thousands of miles. But what makes them really complicated is that they span time. They have to anticipate what's going to happen months in the future. When Bella Canvas comes out and says, hey, this is the fashion that's going to be in the fall, they're not saying because that's what people want. They're saying this is going to be the fashion in the fall because that's what we're making and that's what you're going to be able to buy from us. So this was the biggest problem that print shops faced in 2021 was that they just couldn't get what they needed when they needed it. And this is because print shops occupy a really vulnerable layer in this ecosystem, and I call it layer 2. Layer 2 is probably where you are. Ultimately, if you're in this layer, you're at the whims of the suppliers up top and the customers on the bottom. You're super vulnerable. Any shock in demand or change in the underlying economy really affects your business quickly. And we saw this at Printavo, way back in March 2020. We sort of were like a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, because it was oh wow, this industry is under a ton of pressure because everything just changed. The interesting thing is that as demand kicked back up, it was impossible to catch up. This is kind of what we call the bullwhip effect, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later because it's really interesting. But there's also this third layer emerging in the print game space, and I think it's one you should keep an eye on. These are the print brokers. They don't necessarily touch a t-shirt, but there's a ton of risk here. I'm actually really comfortable saying, like, hey, print brokers are as good as the print shop that prints for them. And, you know, maybe they can get away with being, like, really smart about how the customer experiences the product in the end, from packaging to the emails they get to the whole kind of experience they have. But they're definitely the most vulnerable to problems in the supply chain and, like, labor problems in print shops. I don't think that's controversial, but I could be wrong. So the risk accumulates, but it's disseminated throughout the whole industry. There's also this idea of the bullwhip effect. I love this idea because it's such a simple notion for a very complex thing. The consumer has a bullwhip, and when they spend their money, it cracks that whip. But the whip is really long and emanates throughout this whole supply chain. So, like, a consumer's whims ripple out over space and time. And tiny changes in behavior have big effects in the supply chain because these big manufacturers are making big forecasts and thinking really big about what they need to be able to handle so that they can get every print shop in the United States every t-shirt at once, right? These manufacturers aren't actually accountable to the angry customers. The print shop is. That kind of makes things complicated, but what actually winds up happening is that the manufacturer is kind of accountable to every customer everywhere all of the time. Like, I don't envy what the guys at Sanmar have to face because, wow, they are solving a lot of people's problems. I mean, obviously, this is an impossible task. You can't get everyone everything they need all the time perfectly. And truth be told, it's like a miracle that these systems survived the first true global work stoppage in history. This was not a tiny change in consumer behavior. This was the bullwhip being put down, the consumer walked away, and everyone stopped. Put down your pencils. Stop. They picked it right back up again, started cracking the whip, and everyone expected it to just work magically. But it didn't. So that's where we are. We're in a dangerous era for print shops. There's pressure from all sides, and there's more pressures than just these. We're going to keep talking about this in the future and in more episodes of the weekly because it is really the emergent concern. Supply chain issues, being able to get what you want, and being accountable to the customers, and the manufacturers being accountable to the print shops. The industry and the business model itself, it's under pressure. Creative people will thrive, and people who are sitting still might have a problem. Anyway, that's this week's episode of The Weekly. If you like what you saw, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter at printavo.com/blog/newsletter. And you can always check us out on YouTube and Instagram for more updates. Thanks.